She used my secrets to get close to him. Some wounds cut so deep they reshape the very foundation of who you thought you were. This is the story of one such wound, a betrayal so intimate, so calculated, that it taught me the most painful lesson of all. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who know exactly where to aim the knife. But perhaps I should let the woman who lived through this tell you herself. Her name is Cordelia, and this is her story. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I used to believe that friendship was sacred. I used to think that when you opened your heart to someone, when you shared your deepest fears and most cherished dreams, you were building something beautiful together. A bond that couldn't be broken, a trust that couldn't be shattered. I was 24 when I learned how spectacularly wrong I could be. The story begins with Beatrice Winterbourne, though at the time I thought it began with love. Beatrice had been my closest friend since our university days at Cambridge, where we'd bonded over late-night philosophy discussions and shared dreams of changing the world. She was brilliant, magnetic, and possessed a rare quality that made everyone around her feel special, chosen. When Beatrice smiled at you, you felt like the only person in the room. I should have realized that this gift could be weaponized. The man in question was Lysander Pembroke, and God help me, even now his name makes my chest tighten with a mixture of longing and revulsion. He was everything I'd never known I wanted. Tall and lean with dark hair that always looked slightly disheveled, as if he'd just run his fingers through it. His eyes were the color of winter seas, gray-blue and impossible to read, and when he looked at you with his full attention, it felt like being caught in a spotlight. Lysander was a lecturer in modern literature at King's College London, just 3 years older than me, and possessed of the kind of quiet intensity that made every conversation feel like a revelation. He had this way of tilting his head when he listened, as if your words were the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard, and his rare smiles felt like winning the lottery. I met him at a gallery opening in Shoreditch, where Beatrice had dragged me on a damp Thursday evening in October. I'd been reluctant to go. I was exhausted from my job at the publishing house and wanted nothing more than to curl up with a book and a glass of wine. But Beatrice had that way of making everything sound like an adventure, and I found myself in a cramped gallery space, nursing cheap white wine and pretending to understand abstract art. That's when I saw him. He was standing in front of a particularly jarring piece, something involving twisted metal and red paint that looked like a car accident rendered in art, and he was completely absorbed. Not pretentiously absorbed, the way people often are at gallery openings, but genuinely, quietly fascinated. I found myself drifting closer, drawn by his stillness in a room full of animated chatter. "It's rather unsettling, isn't it?" I said, immediately regretting the banal observation. He turned, and those gray-blue eyes fixed on me with startling intensity. "I was thinking it's rather honest," he replied, his voice low and cultured with just a hint of Yorkshire accent. "Most art tries to make chaos beautiful. This doesn't bother with the pretense." We talked for 2 hours. About art, about books, about the way London looked in autumn when the light slanted through the plane trees just so. He told me about teaching literature to students who thought Dickens was too long and Woolf too difficult, and I told him about trying to find new voices in a publishing world obsessed with trends. When Beatrice finally found me, I was reluctant to leave. "Who was that?" she asked as we walked to the tube station, her voice carefully casual. "Lysander Pembroke," I said, and even saying his name felt significant. "He's a lecturer at King's College." "He's gorgeous," Beatrice said with a laugh. "Those eyes. And did you see the way he was looking at you? Completely smitten." I felt a flush of pleasure at her words, but also something else, a tiny prickle of unease at the predatory gleam in her eyes. Beatrice had always been competitive, even about things that didn't concern her. But I pushed the feeling away. She was my best friend. I was being paranoid. That was my first mistake. Lysander and I began what I hesitantly called dating, though it felt like something much more profound. We met for coffee that stretched into dinner, for walks along the Thames that lasted until the streetlights came on. He introduced me to poets I'd never read, and I gave him manuscripts from promising new authors. We talked about everything and nothing, and I found myself falling in love not just with him, but with the version of myself I became when I was with him. Cleverer, more thoughtful, more alive. It was natural that I would tell Beatrice about him. She was my closest friend, my confidant, and I was bursting with the need to share my happiness. Over wine at our usual spot in Notting Hill, I found myself spilling everything. How he made me laugh, how he listened to me as if my thoughts mattered, how he'd kissed me on Westminster Bridge with the London Eye glittering behind us like a promise. "You're glowing," Beatrice said, refilling my glass. "I haven't seen you this happy since. Well, ever. Tell me everything." And I did. God help me, I told her everything. I told her about Lysander's complicated relationship with his father, a stern academic who'd never quite approved of his son's choices. I told her about his secret dream of writing a novel, something he'd shared with me in the quiet darkness of his flat after we'd made love for the first time. I told her about his fear of not being good enough, smart enough, worthy of the students who looked up to him. I told her about his ex-girlfriend, Penelope, who'd left him for a banker and crushed his faith in love. I told her about the way he took his tea, strong with just a hint of honey, and how he had a habit of buying books he'd never read because he couldn't resist their potential. I told her about the scar on his left hand from a childhood accident and how he unconsciously touched it when he was nervous. I told her everything because I trusted her completely, because sharing my joy with her made it feel more real, more precious. 'Cause I thought friendship meant safety. That was my second mistake. For 3 weeks, I lived in a bubble of happiness so complete it felt surreal. Lysander and I spent every free moment together, and I began to let myself imagine a future. Tentatively, carefully, but with growing certainty. He met my parents, charmed my mother completely, and had long discussions about cricket with my father. I met his colleagues at a department drinks evening, where I somehow managed not to embarrass myself discussing contemporary fiction with professors who'd written the books I'd studied. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, for the universe to let it continue. The first crack in my happiness came on a Wednesday evening in November. I was meant to meet Lysander for dinner at a small Italian place in Bloomsbury, but he cancelled at the last minute. Something about a colleague needing urgent help with a conference presentation. I was disappointed but understanding. Academic life was unpredictable. I called Beatrice instead, hoping for a sympathetic ear and perhaps some company for dinner. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Strange but not alarming. People had lives, obligations, other friends. I went home, made myself pasta, and settled in with a book. It wasn't until later, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram before bed, that I saw it. A photo Beatrice had posted 3 hours earlier. She was at a wine bar in Fitzrovia, laughing at something off camera, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakably familiar, was a head of dark hair and a grey wool jumper I knew intimately. My blood turned to ice water. I stared at the photo for so long my eyes began to water, zooming in, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But I knew that jumper. I'd borrowed it just days before when I'd gotten caught in the rain at his flat. I knew the shape of those shoulders, the way he held his head when he was concentrating. Lysander was at the same wine bar as Beatrice. On the night he'd cancelled our dinner to help a colleague. My hands shook as I called him. It went to voicemail. Called again. Voicemail again. I tried Beatrice, same result. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed running through explanations, rational reasons why they might be in the same place without telling me. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe Beatrice didn't even know he was there. Maybe the colleague he was helping was someone she knew, and they'd all ended up at the same place by chance. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Almost. I met Beatrice for lunch the next day, carefully casual, waiting for her to mention the wine bar. She didn't. She talked about work, about a film she'd seen, about anything and everything except where she'd been the night before. When I finally brought it up, "How was your evening?" I tried to call. She barely missed a beat. "Oh, just a quiet night in with a book," she said, meeting my eyes without flinching. Must have left my phone in another room. I wanted to challenge her, to show her the photo, to demand an explanation. But something held me back. Perhaps the last vestige of my faith in her, or perhaps simple cowardice. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject, even as something cold and hard settled in my stomach. That weekend, Lysander was distant. Not obviously so. He still smiled, still listened, still reached for my hand as we walked through Hyde Park. But there was something different, a subtle shift I couldn't quite name. When I asked if anything was wrong, he assured me everything was fine, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. The second crack came a week later. I was at Lysander's flat, curled up on his sofa with a cup of tea while he graded essays at the kitchen table. His phone buzzed with a text, and without thinking, the casual intimacy of new love making such things feel natural, I glanced at the screen. The message was from Beatrice. "Thank you for understanding about Penelope. It means everything to have someone who gets it." Penelope, his ex-girlfriend. The one who'd broken his heart, whose name he'd whispered to me in the dark of his bedroom when he'd told me about his fear of not being enough. I'd shared that secret with Beatrice over wine and whispered confidences, never imagining it would travel beyond the sacred space of our friendship. "Who's texting?" I asked, my voice carefully light. "Just a colleague," he said without looking up. "Nothing important." Another lie. Another crack in the foundation of everything I'd believed about the people I loved. I began to pay attention then, with the hypervigilance of someone who's realized they're in danger. I noticed the way Beatrice asked careful questions about Lysander during our conversations. How was his writing going? Had he mentioned his father lately? Was he still struggling with that particular student who challenged him in seminars? Questions that seemed like normal friend interest but felt, in retrospect, like reconnaissance. I noticed how Lysander sometimes paused mid-sentence when telling me about his day, as if editing himself. How he'd started mentioning a new friend, someone who understood the pressures of academic life, someone who'd been incredibly supportive during a difficult time. He never said the name, but I knew. The truth revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in dark-room solution. I began to see the shape of what was happening, how my deepest confidences were being transformed into weapons, how my friend was using my own words to create intimacy with a man I loved. I watched Beatrice work with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a master class in manipulation. She began appearing at events where she knew Lysander would be. Academic conferences, book launches, gallery openings. She'd approach him with casual familiarity, as if they were old friends rather than recent acquaintances. "Cordelia's told me so much about you," she'd say, and then proceed to demonstrate just how much she knew. She knew about his novel because I'd told her he was writing one. She knew about his complicated relationship with his father because I'd shared his vulnerabilities. She knew about Penelope because I'd trusted her with his heartbreak. But she presented this knowledge differently than I had. Where I'd shared his struggles with loving concern, she offered solutions. Where I'd sympathized with his insecurities, she provided reassurance. She took the raw material of his inner life, material I'd given her in trust, and crafted herself into exactly what he needed. It was brilliant. It was devastating. It was unforgivable. The end came on a Tuesday evening in December, 3 days before my birthday. I was supposed to meet Lysander for dinner, but he called that afternoon to postpone. "I'm sorry, darling," he said, and his voice sounded strange, distant. "Something's come up. Work thing. Can we do tomorrow instead?" I agreed because what else could I do? But as I hung up, I felt the familiar prickle of unease. On impulse, I decided to walk past the restaurant anyway. It was only a few streets from my flat, and I told myself I needed milk from the shop nearby. I saw them through the window. Lysander and Beatrice, sitting at a corner table, their heads bent close together in intimate conversation. She had her hand on his arm, her face turned up to his with rapt attention. He was talking animatedly, more animated than I'd seen him in weeks, and when she laughed at something he said, he smiled with genuine delight. They looked like lovers. No, they looked like soulmates. I stood on the pavement for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching my friend and my boyfriend share what was clearly not their first dinner together. watching her use everything I'd told her about him to create a connection I'd thought was unique to us. I didn't confront them. I didn't march inside and demand explanations. Instead, I walked home in the December cold, my breath forming clouds in the air, and tried to understand how completely I'd been played. The final revelation came when I arrived home to find a voicemail from Lysander, left just minutes after I'd seen them together. Cordelia, I need to talk to you about us. I know this is terrible timing, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I'll call you tomorrow and we'll sort this out properly. Sorry. I'm so sorry. He didn't call the next day. Instead, he sent a text. I think we need some space. This isn't working the way I hoped it would. I'm sorry. That was it. 3 months of love, of intimacy, of shared dreams, reduced to a handful of sentences that could fit in a text message. But Beatrice called. Course she did. Darling, I have the most wonderful news, she said, her voice bright with false excitement. I've met someone. It's early days, but I think he might be the one. Oh, I managed, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. His name is Lysander, she continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Lysander Pembroke. He's a lecturer, brilliant, funny, just perfect. We connected instantly. It's like we've known each other for years. The audacity of it took my breath away. She was calling to tell me she was dating my ex-boyfriend while pretending not to know he was my ex-boyfriend. She was watching me twist in the wind of my own confusion and heartbreak while playing innocent. That's wonderful, I whispered. I know you'll love him when you meet him, she said. Though actually, I think you might have met him already. At that gallery opening where I first noticed him. He mentioned talking to someone that night, someone lovely. Small world, isn't it? Small world. As if our mutual devastation was nothing more than coincidence. I hung up and promptly vomited into my kitchen sink. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture, though I don't think Beatrice saw it that way. I think she genuinely believed she was sharing her happiness with her best friend, that my pain was an unfortunate but temporary side effect of love's natural chaos. She called regularly to update me on their relationship, each conversation a fresh knife twist. How he'd cooked for her, the same pasta dish he'd made for me on our second date. How he'd taken her to his favorite bookshop in Bloomsbury, the one he'd called our place when we'd browsed there together. How he'd opened up to her about his writing, his dreams, his fears. He's so vulnerable beneath that confident exterior, she'd say, unconsciously echoing words I'd used to describe him to her months earlier. He needs someone who really understands him, you know? Someone who sees past the surface. She was using my own observations about him to explain why they were perfect together. She was turning my insights into their love story. But the cruelest part wasn't the theft of my relationship. It was watching how perfectly she'd learned to be what he needed. Using everything I'd told her about his insecurities, his dreams, his wounds, she'd crafted herself into his ideal woman. She quoted the poets he loved, poets I'd mentioned he admired. She shared interests that coincidentally aligned with his, interests I'd described to her. She even began drinking tea the way he liked it, with honey instead of sugar. She became me, but better. Me without the hesitation, without the self-doubt, without the fear of not being enough that had always held me back. I tried to hate her. I tried to hate him. But mostly I hated myself for being so naive, so trusting, so thoroughly outplayed. The breaking point came at a dinner party in January. Our mutual friend Imogen was celebrating a promotion, and somehow we all ended up around the same table. Me, Beatrice, Lysander, and 6 other people who had no idea they were witnessing a carefully orchestrated psychological destruction. I watched Beatrice work throughout the evening, deploying every secret I'd shared about Lysander with surgical precision. When the conversation turned to literature, she casually mentioned loving the same obscure poet he'd once told me was his favorite. When someone brought up travel, she shared a story about wanting to visit the same remote Scottish island he'd described to me as his dream destination. But the coup de grace came when the talk turned to childhood fears. I've always been terrified of deep water, she said with a self-deprecating laugh. Completely irrational, I know, but there it is. I felt the blood drain from my face. Lysander had told me about his fear of drowning during one of our most intimate conversations, a vulnerability shared in the aftermath of making love. He'd described a childhood accident, a moment of terror that had left him with a phobia he was embarrassed to admit. I'd shared that secret with Beatrice during one of our wine-soaked heart-to-hearts, wondering aloud how to be supportive without making him feel weak. Now she was claiming the same fear as her own, creating a manufactured vulnerability that she knew would resonate with him. And it worked. I watched his face soften as she spoke, watched him reach for her hand with genuine empathy. I understand completely, he said. It's not irrational at all. They shared a look of perfect understanding, built on the foundation of his real fear and her calculated lie. That's when I finally understood the scope of what she'd done. She hadn't just stolen my boyfriend, she'd stolen my entire relationship. Every intimate moment I'd shared with Lysander, every secret he'd confided in me, every vulnerability we'd exchanged, had been carefully catalogued and repurposed. She'd taken the blueprint of our love and used it to build something new with him, something that felt authentic because it was built on authentic emotions, just not her authentic emotions. I excused myself from the dinner and walked home through the January cold, my breath forming clouds that disappeared as soon as they formed. By the time I reached my flat, I'd made a decision. I was done. I stopped calling Beatrice, stopped answering her calls. When she showed up at my flat demanding to know what was wrong, I told her I needed space, that I was going through something difficult and needed time alone. "But we're best friends," she protested, and the genuine confusion in her voice was almost more painful than her calculated betrayal. I don't think she truly understood what she'd done. In her mind, she'd simply fallen in love, and love justified everything. "Yes," I said quietly. "We were." I never told her what I knew. Never confronted her with evidence of her manipulation. What would have been the point? She would have denied it, or worse, justified it. She would have painted herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control, Lysander as the victim of his own heart's choices, and me as the bitter friend who couldn't accept love's natural course. Instead, I let the friendship die quietly, like a plant deprived of water. She tried for a while, calls, texts, even flowers on my birthday. But eventually she stopped trying. Eventually she accepted that our friendship was over, though I doubt she ever understood why. As for Lysander, I heard through mutual acquaintances that they were still together, still happy. Part of me hoped it would fail, that a relationship built on borrowed intimacy couldn't last. But I suspect it might endure precisely because it was built so carefully, so deliberately, using the blueprints of genuine emotion. Beatrice had learned to love him the way I'd loved him, with complete knowledge of his fears and dreams and vulnerabilities. The fact that she'd gained that knowledge through betrayal didn't make the love less real. It just made it stolen. Months passed. I threw myself into work, took up kickboxing, traveled to places that held no memories of either of them. I learned to sleep without wondering what they were doing, learned to go entire days without thinking of gray-blue eyes and rare smiles. I learned to build a life that didn't have a Lysander-shaped hole in it. But the real healing began when I started to understand what I'd actually lost. It wasn't just Lysander, though losing him had felt like losing a limb. It wasn't even just Beatrice, though the friendship we'd shared had been precious to me. What I'd lost was my faith in my own judgment, my belief that I could trust my instincts about people, my certainty that love meant safety and friendship meant loyalty. Beatrice had taught me that the people closest to us have the power to destroy us precisely because we've given them the weapons to do so. Every secret shared, every vulnerability revealed, every moment of trust was also a potential instrument of betrayal. It took me nearly a year to understand that this knowledge, devastating as it was, could also be a gift. Learning to trust again meant learning to trust more wisely. Learning to love again meant loving with both an open heart and clear eyes. I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece, into someone who could recognize manipulation without becoming paranoid, who could be vulnerable without being naive, who could love without losing herself in the process. The final chapter of this story came 18 months later, At another gallery opening, this one in Mayfair, at an exhibition I'd helped organize through work. I was standing in front of a painting that reminded me of that first night with Lysander when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Cordelia! I turned to find Beatrice, looking impeccable as always but somehow diminished. There were lines around her eyes I didn't remember, a tightness to her smile that suggested all was not well in paradise. "Hello, Beatrice," I said calmly. "You look..." She began, then stopped. "You look well. Happy." "I am," I said, and realized it was true. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "About us. I miss our friendship." I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize. But all I saw was genuine sadness, the kind that comes from realizing you've lost something irreplaceable. "Do you miss me?" I asked quietly. "Or do you miss having someone to tell your secrets to?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "That's not. I never meant." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "I don't think you did mean to. I think you simply saw something you wanted and took it the way you've always taken things. The fact that it belonged to me was just an inconvenience to be overcome." "He chose me," she said, and there was something desperate in her voice. "I didn't steal him. He chose me. He chose the version of you that you created using everything I told you about him," I replied. "He fell in love with his own reflection, filtered through your ambition. The question is, do you even know who you really are anymore? Or have you become so good at being what others want that you've lost yourself entirely?" I saw the moment my words hit home, saw her face crumble slightly before she reassembled it into its usual perfect mask. "I should go," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "You should." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the gallery's polished floor, and felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not for what she'd done to me, but for what she'd done to herself. In her desperation to win Lysander, she'd given up her own authenticity. She'd become a carefully crafted fiction, and fictions, no matter how well written, are ultimately hollow. As for Lysander, I heard 6 months later that they'd broken up. Apparently, he'd started to feel like he didn't really know her, like the woman he'd fallen in love with had been a mirage. Friends reported that he seemed confused, hurt, unable to understand how someone could be so perfect for him and yet feel so wrong. I could have told him, but I didn't. Some lessons have to be learned firsthand, and some wounds have to heal naturally, without interference from those who've been wounded before. I never saw either of them again after that night at the gallery. London is vast enough to avoid people if you try, and I tried. I built a new life with new friends, friends I chose more carefully, friends who earned my trust gradually rather than demanding it all at once. I learned to love again too. Different love this time. Steadier, more grounded, built on mutual respect rather than desperate need. When I met James, kind, honest James with his terrible jokes and unwavering loyalty, I told him this story early in our courtship. I needed him to understand why I might seem guarded, why trust came slowly for me. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix me or reassure me that not everyone was like Beatrice. He simply accepted that I'd been wounded and let me heal at my own pace. We've been married 3 years now, and I still sometimes catch myself being careful about what I share, still feel that old prickle of wariness when someone asks too many questions about him. But James has taught me that real love doesn't require you to perform vulnerability. It creates space for authenticity to emerge naturally. I think about Beatrice sometimes, usually when I hear a particular song or pass a place we used to frequent together. I wonder if she ever understood what she'd done, if she ever felt genuine remorse for the friendship she'd destroyed. I wonder if she learned to build relationships on her own merits rather than stolen intelligence. Mostly, though, I try not to think about her at all. The betrayal she orchestrated taught me that trust is not a gift to be given freely but a privilege to be earned slowly. It taught me that friendship without boundaries is not friendship at all, but a kind of dangerous intimacy that can be weaponized by those who mistake manipulation for love. But it also taught me something unexpected. That surviving betrayal doesn't make you harder, it makes you wiser. That learning to trust again after being burned is not naivety but courage. That the capacity to love deeply, even after being hurt deeply, is not weakness but strength. I am not the same woman who stood in that gallery 3 years ago, watching her best friend seduce her boyfriend with stolen secrets. I am not as trusting, but I am more discerning. I am not as open, but I am more authentic. I am not as vulnerable, but I am more resilient. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that real love, the kind worth having, cannot be stolen or manufactured or manipulated into existence. It can only be earned through genuine connection, authentic vulnerability, and mutual respect. Beatrice could steal my secrets, my boyfriend, even my understanding of what I thought I knew about friendship. But she couldn't steal my capacity to love or be loved. That remained mine, scarred but intact, ready to be offered again when the right person proved worthy of it. The woman I am now would never have fallen for Beatrice's manipulation, not because I'm harder or more cynical, but because I've learned to recognize the difference between genuine interest and calculated charm. I've learned to listen to the quiet voice of intuition that whispered warnings I was too trusting to hear. I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who wear the mask of friendship while sharpening their knives behind their backs. But I've also learned that survival is possible, that betrayal is not the end of the story but simply the end of one chapter. The next chapter, the one where you learn to trust yourself again, where you discover your own strength, where you find love that doesn't require you to hand over the keys to your soul, that chapter can be even better than what came before. Not because the betrayal was worth it, it wasn't. But because learning to rise from ashes is its own kind of magic, and the woman who emerges from that fire is someone worth becoming. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I am no longer the woman who believed that trust should be given freely and friendship was always safe. I am something better. A woman who knows her own worth, who protects her heart without closing it, who loves with wisdom rather than desperation. And perhaps most importantly, I am a woman who knows that real friendship, the kind that honors secrets rather than exploiting them, that celebrates your happiness rather than calculating how to steal it, is worth waiting for. The story of my betrayal is not a tragedy. It is a transformation. And the woman I've become is someone I'm proud to be, scars and all. Thank you for watching today's video. If you want more videos like this, please like the video and hit the subscribe button. It helps us in making more of these contents and building this amazing community. Thank you.